Welcome to Homicide Life on the Set, a podcast about the Emmy Award-winning television show Homicide Life on the Street, with myself, Chris Carr, and Susan Ingram. On today's episode, we're joined by cinematographer and director Jean de Segonzac, and we discuss the philosophy behind the look of Homicide. Please note that this episode was recorded before the very sad news of the death of Andre Braugher. Welcome everybody to Homicide Life on the Set with myself, Chris Carr, and Susan Ingram. Susan, what is your connection to Homicide?
I was a camera assistant on the show. Started as a film loader after working with a couple of the crew members on a John Waters film.
Yeah.
Came in as a film loader.
Yeah.
Bumped up to the second. Started on the same year that Jean de Segonzac started. And after the second left in season 2, I moved up to be the second for the rest of the run of the show. So I was a second assistant camera for most of it. And then when we had 2 cameras, I would bump up to first assistant.
Yeah. And what does a second assistant camera do?
In England, we would be called clapper loaders.
Yeah. Yes.
So although we also had a loader on the show, so the second mostly stood by, banged the slate, kept all the camera reports, kept inventories of the film. Although, on that show, maybe the film loader was keeping the inventories and would load up all the carts full of equipment, keep the equipment close by, make sure the first assistant and the cameraman had the equipment that they needed at the time. So lots of running back and forth, or then we had a set bag where we had a lot of stuff right there because we moved around so much. So it's basically supporting the first assistant and the cameraman, making sure they had everything they needed on the set at the time.
Brilliant. It actually can be quite a stressful job, especially if you're doing camera reports, especially towards the end of the day and stuff.
Normally, I would keep the camera reports that were on the back of the slate. And then when we reloaded, that camera report would go with the film to the loading room, and the loader would do all that. I'd been on shows where I did both, where I was the second, and I'd run and reload the film and come back. So it depended on what show you were on. It was always a big relief if you had a camera loader and a second assistant.
Yeah.
So the second could just concentrate on being on the set.
Yeah. When I was at university, it was a bit of a culture shock of loading a 16mm film magazine for the first time, because you had to do it in a dark bag. So you had to do it all by touch. And the way we trained to do it, somebody would have a magazine in front of you with what we call gash stock or gaff stock, where it's, kind of stock that's been used, that's kind of the end of a reel, just to show the other person kind of what they're doing. Because it is quite an intense thing. It's a real skill, because it's very easy to ever so slightly mess it up, and the film doesn't kind of register properly in the camera and makes this weird jittery effect, which has definitely happened on a few productions, not ones I loaded, but other productions I'd seen at uni.
Yeah, most of the shows I worked on, we had a dark room in the truck.
Yeah.
That was all taped off, so you had an actual counter where you could put the film. But if you were on location in the middle of nowhere and you had to reload, in a field or something, we had the black bag, the big black bag. You put in your arms and everything, put everything inside, and load it, reload and reload the film, unload and reload the film inside a black bag. But yeah, I think most people think, oh, was there a red light in there? Like, no, there's no red light. It's in complete darkness, so you don't expose the film.
Yeah, indeed.
So Chris, why don't you tell us how we connected and what your interest was in the show and how we ended up deciding to do the podcast?
Yeah, well, I would first of all say my connection to Homicide is I'm a real homicide enthusiast. And what I mean by that is I don't enjoy murdering people, but I do enjoy the show about investigating murdering people. And so, I reached out to you earlier in 2023 because I have a project that I'm sort of developing that's sort of in the vein of Homicide. It's still being developed at this time. But one thing that struck me from Homicide was not only the quality writing, but I was always really interested in the way the show was shot and edited, because it has quite a fluid feeling, and the editing kind of complements that fluid feeling really well. And it's yeah, it's sort of kind of, it's not particularly jarring. It can be in some places, but it needs to be. But sometimes it just sort of like, you know, as we will talk with Jean, there are some scenes where it's all just in one take, or the camera's just fluidly following the conversation. It kind of moves over to someone else as they're chatting and then back to the other person. And it always has a way of finding whose scene it is and catching the important moments. And I just wanted to try and understand the logic in the DNA of that camera work, because I've never seen anything quite like it, because it's not handheld like a Jason Bourne movie where the camera's shaking and it's saying this is handheld. Homicide kind of had this sort of weird, almost Steadicam like feel, and I once, you know, when chatting with Jean, he mentioned that somebody once asked him if who the Steadicam operator was on the show, and the show was completely handheld with no Steadicam. So I've always been truly fascinated by that. So that's sort of my connection to Homicide.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jean describes his cinema verite filming style, but I think he's unique, and it's not shaky cinema verite. It's really smooth cinema verite, and that was his goal. You know, he really wanted to make it as smooth as possible.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Susan, tell us a little about who Jean is and his connection to the show.
Well, he started his film career as a camera operator and then moving on to work as a cinematographer and director. He started shooting and editing local news and then moved up to network documentaries and PBS documentaries like Nova, American Experience, National Geographic, Explorer, Frontline, American Masters, and 60 Minutes. He shot many notable independent films, but he was noticed for Laws of Gravity, which caught the attention of producer and director Barry Levinson and writer-producer Tom Fontana.
Yeah.
They brought him aboard Homicide on the second season because of that smooth cinema verite style. So he shot 53 episodes of the show in Baltimore from 1994 to 97, and also the follow-up Homicide, the movie, in 2000. But he also directed 6 episodes of the show. So it's interesting that he crossed that line up into directing, but he would direct and shoot together, which also is interesting.
Yeah.
And since then, he worked for the same production company. He directed episodes of Oz, but also Twilight Zone, Battlestar Galactica, CSI, FBI, Law and Order, and 52 episodes of Law and Order SVU, among many, many other sort of New York-based TV shows, many of which were under the Dick Wolf production label.
Thanks, Susan. Let's move into that interview with Jean, and we'll be back afterwards.
First of all, great to have you with us, Jean. We're calling the podcast Homicide: Life on the Set, and we're hoping to talk to a lot of people, different departments, but obviously we wanted to talk with you first. My first contact and our first idea of doing this was after talking to Chris, who is interested in how the show was shot and developing possibly some projects in England. And so, of course, the look of the show was such a big part of it. So that's why we wanted to touch base with you first and talk with you. So you want to give us a little bit about your background? Obviously, we know that you come from documentary films, that you worked all over the world, and that there was a sort of transition film where you were able to do a dramatic film using your documentary techniques, which was the name escapes me at the moment. Tell me the film.
Laws of Gravity.
Right, Laws of Gravity. I just watched part of it the other day. You could really see the connection between the way you shot that and what you brought to Homicide, but which all obviously evolved over time. So give us a little background about how you got your start in the business and how you ended up with Homicide.
I started out while in college. I got a job shooting news at the local TV station, WCMH. I did nights and weekends. And there was a non-union shop, so I'd drive the car, I'd shoot the film, I'd process the film, edit the film, and put it up on the projector. And so this was a terrific way to get a lot of experience shooting. and it was almost all handheld. And and eventually my dream was to do documentaries, to do verite documentaries, but that didn't really quite work out. There were far and few of the verite style documentaries being produced, and I ended up shooting mostly shows like Frontline and Nova, National Geographic, West 57th Street, and 60 Minutes. I thought that would be the ultimate experience, 60 Minutes. It was not. But I still did do many 60 Minutes, some with Diane Sawyer, which was very pleasant and very fun. And but that eventually the video camera came out, the beta cam. I had to go buy a beta cam. And so the interviews, the talking heads, as we used to call them, went from being at most 10 minutes, very expensive. A 10-minute load of film is quite expensive. It's over $200 at the time. And but now we had a beta cam, and the interviews started to drag out up to 3 hours. And so I got quite fed up with the whole thing, and started asking around. I just asked, look, anybody hear of anything? I'd like to try to do narrative. By that time, I had so many lights and so many filters, so obviously I was interested and ready to do more with the camera and with the lighting and with the effects. And so I put a word out, and I got an offer to look at my reel. So I showed my reel. It was for a film called Laws of Gravity, directed by Nick Gomez. And they looked at the reel. They said, "This is great." And they asked me to shoot the film. I was so excited, and I dreamed that I was going to have dollies and cranes. I'm going to do all this stuff. And they go, no. You're going to shoot exactly the way you shot your reel. It's all going to be handheld. And they even had the idea that they wouldn't let me see the scene that I would step upon on the set, and they would just play the scene. I would be having to shoot it as if it was a documentary, and as if I had never seen or heard anything. I dissuaded them about that, but because it was a low-budget film, 10 days shoot, $40,000. They used all my documentary lighting gear and my Aton camera, and so to make it work, I would shoot one moving master that would catch, listening and trying to catch what's going on and following the action, and then I would do an opposite master, a complementary master that could cut with the other one, and that was it. That's all we would do. Two takes, two master takes, and sometimes we do only one. Some scenes were just one shot. So Nick Gomez became quite famous for that film, and he got a job the first season of Homicide to direct an episode. And of course, his calling card was Laws of Gravity. So they're looking at that footage and they're thinking, wait a second, maybe we could get this guy to shoot the show. And the show was a bit on the cusp. The first season was only 9 episodes. And the second season, where I started, was only 4 episodes. And it was sort of a way of saying, well, can you guys really make this work? And so I ended up getting the job. And the first director that I worked with was Chris Minot, English director who had done Prime Suspect. And I showed him Laws of Gravity. He was very excited, and he said, "Oh, this is great. You know what we'll do? We're going to take it one step further. We'll do everything as just a single take with no coverage." He almost got me fired in the first 2 episodes because that's what he was attempting to do. In the end, I just watched those 2 episodes. They were really quite good, and they did have several scenes that were all very, very nicely figured out and choreographed, and to tell the story and end up on the guy who was being the most impacted for the button of the scene. And so I got a lot of trouble. He got a lot of trouble, but in the end, it worked out terrific. After Chris left, and then we had John McNaughton from Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, and who I knew from Chicago. And so that episode worked out extremely well. But then the penultimate of that first season, of course, was the episode with Robin Williams.
Robin Williams.
It was just such an extraordinary thing to have him on set, and the kids were particularly fantastic on that show.
One of whom was Jake Gyllenhaal, right?
It was
Yeah,
Jake
when he was a
Gyllenhaal.
kid.
He must have been
Yeah.
12 years old. He was 12 years old. The kid was amazing, and there was this little girl whose name escapes me. She was so good. So anyway, that's how I got to the point of taking my documentary style. Now, there were two styles of documentary being done at the time, which was the Maisel brothers. They like to observe and zoom in and focus and zoom back out, and there's I found this stuff sometimes to be a little shaky. They're fantastic films. Don't get me wrong, but I was enamored with a cameraman named a great name, Don Lenzer, who was a terrific cameraman, and his stuff was always super smooth, very smooth camera work, and so I got very excited about that, and I worked on how to carry the camera and make it as smooth as possible, and to walk in such a way that there wouldn't be lumps and bumps and shakes, and try to keep the rise and correct. And I'm looking at this stuff now, and it still looks a bit shaky, but in general, it's pretty smooth.
Well, there's one shot in there's two shots in See No Evil that really stood out for me. You were talking about these continuous takes earlier. There's a brilliant sequence I was just talking to Susan about just before we started, where Lewis is having a kind of a fight with Beau in the bathroom, where they're having this sort of debate about whether the guy should be convicted or not. And I realized it's all in one take. I was watching it casually, and then I thought, hang on a minute, halfway through, is this one take? And it was. And also you have like mirrors in there, and there's so much stuff going on.
Right.
And well done to Clark Johnson for hitting his marks, because I've worked with actors and sometimes they can be hopeless at hitting marks. And there's other scenes where you're like walking down the stairs with the camera. I'm like, how on earth are you doing that? And it's so smooth.
Well, that particular scene in the bathroom, I watched it the other night, and I was also surprised myself. I think, wow, how do we do that? And I remember we're in the bathroom thinking, okay, we need to place the mirror. We place it here, then we can get this guy and that guy, and it is all going to click together. And to make this stuff work, I would basically learn my lines and figure out where, and the cue words that would send me to pan to this guy, and then the word that might send me back. So I learned that.
Yeah, and talk a little bit more about that. Your transition from the idea of the verite, which was not knowing what was happening next, so you were just reacting, to then, I think the more homicide technique was, like you were just talking about, you knew the scripts, you knew what was happening, so that you would be able to get to the action as it happened, not react to it after it happened. So talk a little bit about the transition to that idea that I think you were happier with and more comfortable with than the reactive sort of camera style initially.
Well, the truth is that as a documentary cameraman, I filmed a lot in Poland and the Soviet Union, in places where I did not understand the language, and I bought an Aton. So the Aton has an eyepiece which is here, and you can see with your other eye what's going on to the right and to the left. You can watch and you can feel and you can anticipate. So I felt like I developed a technique of just feeling the vibe of who's going to speak next and what's going to be happening. How is this going to go? So it's not just well, of course, someone suddenly enters the room. Oh, and I'm going to pan over and find them. So I was trying to keep that with Homicide. That I was in the middle of the situation, almost like another person in this scene, really, observing and listening and reacting. But of course, I had the added advantage of having seen the scene played out, so I could make a plan. Because there were times, I remember clearly, there were times when we'd have a 6-page scene, and it would be run as a 6-page scene. And I try to figure it out. I'm going to go from here, okay, from there, I'll go there. And then, but after about 4 minutes into the scene, I couldn't keep track of what I was doing. So then we'd say, okay, forget it.
What were the rules of kind of continuity for that then? Because that must be quite, when shooting a scene like that and that kind of free start, must be quite difficult to sort of bring all that into the edit. Because one thing I love about Homicide, the camera always manages to find the person whose sort of scene it is and that gets the reaction every time. It's brilliant.
Well, this is something about Homicide that I think most people wouldn't know, is that we rarely put down marks. I think there were maybe 3 times where I remember actually putting a mark. Once for Yaphet, because he's a very big guy, and he kept twice. He blocked the scene, and he got very angry. I've been in this business 30 years, and it's customary to put down a mark. And so we did put down a mark for him. But normally there would be no marks. Everyone would find the ballet and just remember it. Really, it's an interesting a physical thing to have a camera and be in the midst of actors. Sometimes we'd have 8 actors who would be in a scene who might speak, and you have to find a way of describing everything, so the camera often would go towards somebody. The 2 people are talking and go right in between them, and then come out on the other side. So that means that one actor would have to allow the camera to come in, would have to back away, and then come back in as if they hadn't moved, and then let the camera through. And it's not just the camera that's moving; it's the camera and the cameraman and myself and the Boots Shelton, who was the focus puller. The 2 of us would be sliding through, and behind us would be the boom operator who's recording the sound, and he very quickly got himself a monitor. And we had a transmitter, so he could see the shot that I'm doing, because you never really know what I was going to be doing. I tried to tell him, well, I'm going to try this and this and this, but at one point, you're just going to have to follow. So there'd be 3 of us moving around, and then often the gaffer, Josh Spring, would also be in the mix with also a boom and a china ball to get a little extra light into Yaphet's face. And so now we have 4 people moving around in a crowd of several actors. So it becomes like a ballet.
Yes, and watching you, it very much was that way. Were you just inherently graceful, or did you learn that, in some of your earlier? I mean, you really were quite dancerly, and also the way you could boom down, you would hold the camera and squat all the way to the ground, keeping your feet flat, and then boom up and then stand up. Was kind of an amazing movements you were able to do. Were you just graceful as a kid, or did you learn that somewhere?
As a kid, I wanted to be a jet pilot, so I would fly through the house, up and down the stairs, and the jet goes very smooth. So, no, it's just something I developed, almost like a Tai Chi, and I wanted it to be smooth. I want to be able to sink down and come back up and go around people and push into somebody who was just injured, and tell the story that way.
What kind of equipment are you using? Because I think we had an earlier chat and you said some people approached you about who's the Steadicam operator? And you were saying there was no Steadicam on the show. So what kind of camera equipment and grip equipment were you kind of using? And also, how do you light for this sort of movement?
Okay, so as far as the camera, we use a 16 millimeter Aton. I think it was with Cook lenses and super speeds, and and I had a bag made for the camera because I liked it. It's a blimp, so you can shove the camera into my face. The camera also had an arch that fit on your shoulder, but I didn't like that, so I put a flat piece of metal so I could have more control of the camera. And then behind, I put the batteries and the transmitter to balance the camera out. Because what you want is the camera on your shoulder to be almost a lightweight with no weight at all. And you get your elbows into your side, and you hang on to the camera, and you move the camera with your body. I see a lot of guys that they move like this. They move their arms around. It's their body that should be moving.
And two handles. You had two handles constructed, or instead of just the one handle, correct?
Yeah, I had two handers. Did I have two or just the one? I can't remember.
I think it was two.
But two I think is a good idea, because then you do your zoom on one, and you have your other, and so your whole body is controlling the camera, and the that is the camera that we use the whole time, including when we came back to do Homicide the movie. It was the same camera. It was absolutely the greatest camera for handheld. Nowadays, of course, we have the Aeroflex Mini, which is very small, and you can set that up just as well as an Aton, really, and so fantastic stuff. And now, as far as the lighting, then obviously I always, or we had to light so we could look in any direction, and this doesn't always make for the most elegant lighting, but it certainly is a real lighting. The people on this side might start from looking left and look all the way right and go around people. Then we would light it such a way that any part of the set. You could walk to any part of the set and get the shot. And if some part gets a little dark, then we'd have a Josh with his pole and his China ball lit to follow. In fact, when we would be in the streets at night, we would get a lift and put lights on the lift. But the lights normally were PARs, which would just light up the buildings. And we wouldn't light up the actors. I would be with the actors, and we backing up, and Josh would have his China ball, and he was responsible for getting it in the right place to make a nice lighting on the faces. So we'd light the general set, the whole outdoor set, and then just carry just like you would in a documentary, carry a China ball to light the actors in the foreground.
It's a really good looking show. There's a lot of depth to the lighting, because I think there's a danger when trying to light for a 360 that everything just becomes the same sort of stop almost, that there's no darkness. I mean, I noticed, like, and I think Susan mentioned this when we were chatting, like the actors are always a bit brighter than the background, which is a good thing. I noticed on the show that other shows sometimes, when they're moving around, don't have.
Well, in the studio set, we had big open frames with the light coming straight down, so that would be our basic. And then it was designed in such a way that there were archways with windows, so we could bring lights through there. And then we had all the lamps on the table, which would be our practicals. It kept it really simple. But we also were using fluorescent lights mostly in the squad room. We'd hang them up here or hang them up. It was basically I always see a lot of complicated lighting going on, but in fact, if you have two people talking to each other, you can have a key light hitting the person on the left. It becomes the person on the right's backlight, and you do the same thing from the other person. You have another light. So with two lights, you can actually light a scene with two people. It's very simple, and that's exactly what we'll do. We just do a kind of cross lighting. And the room itself would be its own fill, unless we had to bring in a little special, sometimes we'd walk in with what we call an eye light. It's just a little brick with a little light inside, just to give a little something into the eyes. Very simple. And one of the things that was interesting is, of course, we had the squad room. That was the only set. The first season, there was no morgue. We went to the actual city morgue. Wow. Where we saw the most horrific stuff, and it smelled dreadful, but we went to the actual city morgue and filmed in there until the second season. They finally built us a morgue near the stage. This stage had no moving walls of any kind. The only thing that moved were the windows. You could move them just to get to control reflections, but nothing else could move. And it was the whole idea. Well, you're shooting a documentary. You're going to use the space as it exists.
Talking about reflections, the box. How did you film in the box? How was that?
Okay, so in the box, yes, that was a good trick. We now sometimes we want to go 360 around the box, but the one wall had a big mirror in it, and so we'd be limited. So then we had the idea of removing the mirror, putting a clear glass, and we made miniatures of the objects, tables and stuff in the room, and put it in the other room, so it looked like it was the reflection. It was just, and we would go through it very quickly, and you would feel like it was still a mirror, because it would be mirroring some objects that were in the room, not the main table with people in it, of course, but that mirror is at a funny angle. So with little tricks like that, we were able to do 360s, and but then when we were in the observation room looking into the box, then that would become a one-way piece of glass that we were able to move around and to set the reflections of the people watching. And so I, as a cameraman, being in the middle of it, I don't want to see myself. So we had what we called a noir. Basically, you wear a cloak of black and a hood and everything, and black gloves, so you don't reflect.
The shroud.
The shroud, yeah.
Yeah, and was the mirror also a sort of when gimbals or able to tilt both directions, so you could sort of get some of the reflections out of the way when we were in the box?
Yes, it was. We're always playing with reflections. I saw one shot from the first season. I still can't figure out how we did it. We're in the car looking at Melissa Leo, and yet she's perfectly reflected in the rear view mirror of the guy's car that the camera happens to be in. And I don't remember, did we bring another big mirror and just reflect her into the... Because we were doing silly stuff like that all the time. Because what was fun about this show is that you have 12 hours a day to do it for 8 months. 5 days a week. So then we'd always be trying to come up with new stuff. What other fun thing can we pull off?
And I'm going to bounce back to what Chris asked about the editing, that at some point, I mean, the editors really appreciated the more you could give them. So the more sort of, crossover master shots, they didn't worry about crossing the line, that they were happy with. The more you gave them, the happier they were. Is that true?
I think so. I feel like the first season, I gave them less. And some of that I think is better, because you really had to make a choice. I would beg them. I said, look, for you, I went out of my way and did my masters and then did some coverage to give you guys leeway. Because we would deliver 48 minutes and the scripts were 62 pages. So we'd be delivering, your cut would be sometimes 10, 12 minutes over. So you need to be able to cut it down. You have to have a chance to edit. And but then what I felt was that some of the editors would just turn it into a mixed salad. They would just chop it all up. And I would beg them, look, no, please try to use the most elegant take that lasts the longest. Look for that first before you start turning it into a choppy soup.
One thing, talk about the editing, that Homicide had as a sort of signature was a sort of repetition of the same shot, like somebody slamming their hand on a desk to make a point and stuff. Were those planned, or were they found in the edit?
No, those are found in the edit. The whole point of as far as what Barry Levinson told me was that their inspiration was the film Godard's film Breathless. And in Breathless, it was a handheld film, beautifully, very, very steady handheld, much of it. And Jean-Paul Belmondo, being mercurial as he is, or as he was, he would do the scene and find himself in different parts of the room by the end of the scene. And so they had all this footage where he'd be jumping around. They said, okay, fine, we'll just use that. So Homicide was sort of the same idea. We sometimes would shoot a scene and then reblock it and shoot it again. So just to give them that fun, if they wanted to jump people around and to make these jump cuts. But yes, a lot of them were created in editing.
Yeah.
Some of these double shots, because I would find myself trying to perfect a shot, and repeating it 2-3 times, so they would be able to cut from take 1 to take 3, and would often do that.
Yeah, yeah. There's one that comes to mind where Andre's ripping off something off a wall, and they like show it 3 times. I think, God, did he have to rip that off 3 times?
Yes, he did.
He probably did between the takes, and they cut the 3 together.
Yeah, no, it's a very effective thing. I quite liked it. I even imitated it in my first ever short film. But
And it's interesting, some of the choices. I was watching Sniper Part 1 and 2 last night, and there was a hallway scene in the hospital, which could have just gone. It was about 30-second shot, and they come off of a hospital counter where they had been looking at some files, and they'd make a turn, and they go down another hallway, and there's people passing on both sides. And I'm watching, and I'm thinking, first of all, how did Jean get in there? Well, everything's moving, and there's people going multiple directions. But also, it would have been fine with just that one 30-second take, but it was cut from a couple different angles, including there must have been, maybe you went up on a ladder, but then there was the last shot was a high shot above them coming down the hall after there was a second moving shot with them. And I thought that's the interesting choice of, let's do that a couple different ways instead of just staying with, you coming down the hallway with them once. So that may be part of what you're just talking about, that you wanted to give them choices.
Right, choices, especially with the walk and talks, they need to shorten it. They have a chance. But I also, at one point, fell in love with high wide shots, so we were doing a lot of those. At one point, I fell in love with the Dutch tilts. I was just starting the scene with the camera at an angle and then straightening it out. And I was doing that for a couple of weeks till I got a phone message from Tom Montana saying, it said, enough with the fucking Dutch tilts.
They're quite seductive. I quite like them.
So then I quit with the Dutch tilt. No more Dutch tilts.
That's funny you mentioned that. On one of the episodes I was watching, they were just writing on the board. I guess they had finally solved one of the multiple murders, and they're wiping off like 4 of the red names and rewriting them in black. And it was a close up on the names, and then the camera starts going like this. And then it cuts back to a close-up straight, and then it cuts back to it a little farther around the rotation.
Right.
And then it cuts back to it straight, and then it cuts back to it all the way around the rotation. And it was so interesting that we're just looking at a couple names, but it really sort of drove home the point of the story, which was the impact of what had been happening in Baltimore with the serial killer,
the sniper.
The sniper.
Well, I found that the mood in it with the detectives is very off balance and sometimes confusing, and so at times the camera gets even more frenetic depending on the situation, or quieter. It really depends on the scene as to how you feel it. Because it's listening, but it's also feeling. I feel this is what's happening, how I'm watching it. And so disorientation and urgency, especially when there was a red ball, was something that we would try to emphasize with the camera. But I was also going to say that it's interesting that we only had 2 sets. And that the main set is Baltimore itself. And I watched a few episodes recently, and it is an amazing looking city. This is unlike any other city. And Philadelphia might have stuff a little bit like that, but and nothing compares to Baltimore. The architecture, the streets, the places is just incredible, and with such an amazing set. And so when we would, I don't recall us building anything. We would find locations, and even locations. Like if I showed some of those locations to a New York crew, they would they would laugh in my face. Are you kidding? Because we went into locations because the homes in Baltimore can be extremely small. Some of them are 8 feet wide, and the rooms are tiny. But it was no. We're gonna manage, because it'll be just me and Boots pulling focus, and we're just gonna just skinny guys. We're going to go in with the skinny guys. And we would light from outside with little tiny lights glued to the wall, battery-powered lights, and got into places. It's just sensational.
Yeah, that's true. Baltimore row houses are known for their narrowness.
So narrow.
Yeah, were there any particularly challenging locations? Because I've heard stories of like chases that have come through your set, and somebody surrendered to the crew once or something, and various other things.
Oh well, that was an extraordinary day. We were in an alley, and we were rehearsing this scene, and then we had all of our main actors with the guns out, and we had a guy on the floor, the perp, on the ground in the alley, and we're just. Unfortunately, I didn't have the camera in hand, and then we heard in the distance, "Stop! Stop! Stop him! Stop him!" And a man comes running into the alley and lands right on top of us, and sees us and goes, "Oh shit!" And he had 2 bags full of Polaroid film.
Yeah, bags.
2 full bags of shopping bags of Polaroid film. He puts them down on the ground and just goes up and puts his hands up on the nearest wall and spreads his legs and is ready to be arrested. But the security guard who comes around the corner is also shocked to see us and doesn't understand, but cups our man and walks him away. We were all like quite astonished and a little scared, really. And when they took him away, then we couldn't stop laughing for about 2 hours. It was very disruptive.
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant.
But there was one time I remember we were filming and we had to stop because somebody had been shooting a gun out of a window into the park. They bought a new gun and they were testing it out.
Was that what we found out? Because we were near. Was that when we were shooting near Druid Park Lake?
Yes.
And we were, I think, had just either before or come down from shooting up in one of the high-rise old apartment buildings, and we were on the street, and there was shots going off, and we were ducking behind cars. But I didn't know that. So that was the resolution of it. I didn't know that.
No, so they had bought this gun, and
There's somebody just testing their gun.
Yeah, there were 3 of them, and they were taking turns shooting into the lake because it was a cool gun they got. And but there was a 1-hour disruption for us. We had to shut down while they figured out who was shooting. But that is one part of Baltimore that was sometimes a little frightening. It was can be a scary place. There's definitely parts that we filmed in that were very, very run down and very sad, and especially the back alleys. It's just unbelievable mess that were accumulated back there. But it make for terrific sets, free sets.
Yeah. And I do remember often, especially on Gay Street and those areas where we'd walk, I especially remember the fire episodes where there would more than every other house would be boarded up. But when we got there, and there was a lot of night shooting, people would come out on their porches and chat with us like they were happy at least somebody was paying attention to their neighborhoods. And I was always astonished at how welcoming people were when, this horde descended on their neighborhood out of the blue.
Right.
But they were often, except for one time, where apparently we swept a drug corner and the dealers weren't happy we were there. But in general, the people in the neighborhoods were very friendly, and that really struck me.
Right.
Do you remember that, Jean?
Yes, I do. That though I remember once we were in front of a project, and the scene called for one of our detectives or somebody to fire their weapon with their blanks, and I remember clearly there were all these people not paying any mind, walking around, and suddenly our gunshot went off, and we saw like 20 people just throw themselves to the ground. These were not people involved in the filming, but the just sound of the gunshot just immediately they hit the ground. So it was something they were probably dealing with on a regular basis, which was unfortunate.
Well, Jean, you weren't only the cinematographer on the show, at least for the first few seasons, but you also directed many episodes of the show. And obviously Sniper Part 1 is your sort of directorial debut on the show. What was that like, crossing over to being a director?
Well, for me, it was very exciting, of course. I can tell you that when on the first day and they said, okay, we're in, my heart was beating so fast I thought I might fall over, seemed silly, but it's just what happened. And once it started working, then it all fell into place. I do remember I had a fancy dolly shot that I had planned out that I was doing. I was on take 5 when I suddenly felt a tremendous pain in my left arm, and I look over, and it's the line producer, Jim Finnerty, and he says, every time you do that shot, it costs me $5,000. And again, my heart started pounding. Okay, God, I'm so sorry. And I do remember that first day.
He was definitely to be feared.
It was to be feared. And I do remember that first day being behind at lunch, so I was a little concerned. But I would just watch that episode last night. I was pretty surprised. I didn't remember it being it was really good. It was just interestingly.
Yeah, and I can't remember. I saw the DP listed as Phil Oedeker. Did you operate any, or were you back in Video Village? Were you standing next to the camera with the?
I operated the whole thing.
You did? Okay, I couldn't remember.
Say that was a whole advantage. No,
Right.
Phil was the DP of note, and he did do the lighting. I didn't concern myself much with it, but I did operate, and that for me as a director was a tremendous advantage, because I can be in the middle of the situation and with the camera, and then that didn't work. Let's start over. Let's go again. Or we got that. Let's go once more right away. And I'm doing a different shot. I'll tell the boots. I'm the focus puller. I'm going to go from here to here, and the actors would often ask, "Am I going to be on?" And I would say, it's none of your business. I wouldn't tell them, because this is traditional filmmaking, is that an actor's not going to be on camera. They're not going to deliver the emotion and the intensity. And that was one of the great advantages of Homicide, was that the actors were all going to be on, and if they weren't, I wouldn't tell them. They said, "No, you're definitely going to be on," and so they'd all have to pump it up. They would never be able to lowball it, and rest. And I think that adds a lot to the intensity of the show.
I was going to say, what's your recollection of how the actors, how they responded to your all of a sudden being not just behind the lens, but also directing them?
Never. It's never good. I think this is the big problem of being a DP and trying to go into directing. First of all, the producers are not going to trust that you know anything about acting, and the actors are not going to trust that some camera head coming on set is going to know anything about what they're doing and their acting and all this. And in fact, I remember clearly. I was setting up a shot and talking to somebody, had the script out, and Andre Bauer looks over at me and he goes, he says, "That idiot actually thinks he's directing." So I learned two things. That number one, to be a director, is you're going to have some humiliating moments, which don't happen when you're a DP normally. Another thing that's going to happen is that the actors are not going to trust a DP becoming a director until they learn to trust you, until you can actually show that you know what you're doing and that you are watching what they are doing, because that's the important part. That's the difficult part, though. When you're operating and you're in the middle of it, it's all great, because then that's a lot of energy for the actors. But then sometimes I might miss some acting that could be improved, because I'm in the middle of all this excitement, and I didn't see any a problem with on Homicide. All the acting was superb from beginning to end, because it was such a terrific group of actors, just sensational. And they would always come to set, prepared or not, they knew their lines. And you could do a 6-page scene without anybody flubbing. And you could walk somebody from downstairs all the way upstairs into the place and pick up a conversation there, swing over, and there's somebody else doing something. And then here comes Giardello, and we follow him into his office, and then someone comes in and starts yelling at him, all one shot. And it was, you can only do that with really superb actors. Well, I also wanted to say that, because we had this terrific group of actors, but then what I found extraordinary about Baltimore was that many of the day players were local Baltimore people, and they were all so good, so sensational, and I sometimes feel bad about it. I saw so much talent, and there's not enough work for people with this talent. But it was incredible how many people were just brought in right out of Baltimore or Washington D.C. Maybe somebody would come from Georgia, but mostly it was local people.
Yeah, Pat Moran did the casting and of course had so many local contacts from the John Waters films because she was part of the John Waters crew. So she really had deep files
Right.
of actors in Baltimore. Really terrific character people. Really terrific.
Right. Well, that was one of the fun things about first of all, Baltimore, and the whole crew had been working for John Waters. This was a John Waters crew, from the grips to the electricians, the hair, makeup, clothing. They had all worked on John Waters for YouTube. So it really was such a fun group of people.
What was a day like as a director on Homicide, and even as a DP? You know, because you mentioned earlier you did 12-hour days and stuff, but what was it sort of physically like being on Homicide?
Well, the Homicide was run by a man named Jim Finnerty, and I don't know how he pulled this off. I'd not seen it on any other show. But at 7 a.m., we would say, we're in. At 7 a.m., when he said we're in, every actor who was going to be in the scene was standing there in their clothes, in their makeup, hair done. And the camera was right next to me, ready to go. The soundman was ready to go. We'd rehearse. By 7:20, we'd be shooting already, or 7:15 sometimes, because we often would start with the scene either in the squad room or outside, so we could immediately get going. And now every show I've been on since, you have a 7 a.m. call, and the first shot is never before 8 a.m., 1 hour later. So I'm losing a whole hour in the day just right there. And so that was quite an extraordinary thing. I thought that's what it was on every show. And I was sorely sorely disappointed when
we knew we had to be there. You know, it may have said on the call sheet a 7 a.m. call, but we knew we had to be there.
Well, in Los
at the
Angeles,
latest, a quarter of. So we could get all the camera equipment upstairs under the set or wherever by 7, because we'd be working at 7. We wouldn't be putting the camera together at 7, right?
No, but then on most shows that would be a pre-call, and I don't know that happened on Homicide. I know that in Los Angeles, I've been in Los Angeles where the truck doors do not open until, as they say, we're in, and it's really aggravating to me. So at 7 a.m. then the truck doors open, and then people can go in and get their stuff. And so Homicide was run a completely different way. And I like to think that the filmmaking is still a sort of artisanal business, because I've been on many shows, and I don't know two that were run the same way.
And how many pages a day did you guys have to film?
Okay, this is maybe, Susan, you can remind me, but I remember the first day we were on the set that I was working, and we were just trying to finish up the lighting, and it took about an hour and 15 minutes before we finally got it to actually be okay to film, and it was quite frightening to me, but I remember that day we were supposed to do 16 pages, and I don't know if they were trying to break the camel's back on the first day. Wow. I couldn't understand, and I was too inexperienced to say, don't be ridiculous, we're not doing 16 pages, just forget it. And in the end, we did manage to shoot 12 pages. It's a very talky show. So if you're not out at night and all this kind of stuff, you can certainly count on shooting anywhere from 8 to 10 pages a day. That is pretty normal. Now, we did have scenes. I remember one, which was a very big invasion of a house, a helicopter involved, people on ropes coming down and crashing through windows. That day was a page and a half, a 12-hour day, a page and a half. That was unusual. But we could move very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, I'm looking at, I actually have some call sheets I saved because I had to save some of them for the union. I'm looking at, eight pages is, pretty standard. So yeah, 16 page day. Was that on See No Evil?
I think it was the very first episode. This is what I remember. Of course, I don't have a great memory, but
Yeah.
I remember
I think
being
it's
in conflict with
possible. Yeah,
the
absolutely.
first AD about it. And
all I can say is no wonder the director wants to do everything just in one continuous take, because the best way to film 16 pages.
Right.
Right,
But if you can figure it out and you get it on. But also, I think what's interesting is that to do a one take scene, it takes a bit of choreography, and if you watch some of the scenes, it's very clear that okay, this guy's got a line. This guy crosses through with a line, which brings us to this guy who has a line, and then he steps over to grab a coffee, saying his line, and somebody is already leaning against the table, and they got their line. Then you swing to somebody else. We always create a kind of a choreography to accommodate this, a kind of a dance, really, to accommodate all the lines and the people, and also to keep it from being static, because you could have a conversation where 4 people just stand there and talk, or they could be moving around for whatever reason they can. And the actors are very good at finding why they might move around. That they're doing this or they're picking up that.
So back to the typical day, do you feel like Jim really sort of whipped us into staying on track?
Well, I think very much. He'd come over to me and tap his watch and have a conscience. Have a conscience.
Yes, the watch tapping, yes.
And at the end of one season, though, he did run out of the office and grab my hand and shook it really hard and say, "You saved us $1 million, over the season." Because we did end up with 8-hour days and 10-hour days. It did happen. Sometimes the crew was unhappy. I got surrounded a couple times by the grips going, "Hey, slow down, buddy. We have mortgages to pay." So there'll be a bit of that. But I felt that what's best for the actors is to move fast so they don't get bored and they don't go back to their trailer and get comatose. You've got to keep it exciting, got to keep it fun and fast. So we were able to complete our days in a reasonable fashion. And the nice thing about Baltimore was that most of the crew lived nearby. Like when I work in New York, many of the crew come in an hour and a half commute there and back.
Yeah.
And then they have the 12 to 14-hour day. And you call lunch and you see people just look around like dogs and just drop to the ground and go to sleep. And we didn't have any of that on Homicide, because everybody lived just right there. In fact, we'd finish shooting, the whole crew would end up in the bar across the street. It was very collegial.
Really? First the waterfront and then Cooper's Tavern.
Right.
Yeah, and you had an apartment just a few blocks away, right? You had an apartment in town in Fells Point.
Right, I had to walk to work.
Just a few blocks away, yeah. And that's true. I lived outside of town in the county, but it still only took me a half an hour to get down to the set. So even though, okay, I'll give you, so maybe we did have an 8 or 10-hour day. I don't remember that, but maybe we did. But still, on the general, it's a 12-hour day. And even though you lived close by and, and you didn't have a big commute, it was a physical job for everybody. But if you're the artiste, you've got the camera in your hand and you're doing this sort of amazing physicality of movement all day long, every day. How did you keep the stamina? I mean, how did you keep that together?
Well, I don't know. I like to work, so I don't think I had a problem. I did feel every year that you'd start with so much enthusiasm. By February, you're getting a little down, like, will this ever end? And then your enthusiasm builds as you come to the end of the season. But I did develop because we're doing a 12 hours handheld every day. I did develop an enormous bruise on my shoulder, and I tried to figure out how to get that pain away. I built a brace to try to get the camera off my shoulder, and but it made for a lumpier camera work. So yes, I put
We had a little pad. Didn't we have a shoulder pad that we stuck under there
that I
too?
put
Yeah,
under my
I just had a
t-shirt.
flashback. Where's the pad?
Yes, it
He was
was
on the
a
pad,
piece
right?
of foam that I put under my t-shirt. That was the only thing, the main thing. I mean, I do remember days where the day was over, and then I'd be going with the director to dinner and just be a soggy, sweaty mess, a little embarrassed. But yeah, it was physical. It was good.
Yeah, yeah. One very wide question. Are there any particular episodes, characters, stories, or incidents that sort of stand out for you on the show?
Well, there were so many. The one I really enjoyed there was an episode called The Hat that Peter Maddock directed with Lily Tomlin,
Oh, yes.
and
Yeah.
and Peter Maddock is such a lovely guy. To have him as a director, that it was great. And then Lily Tomlin was just delightful, and she was terrific in that episode. So I remember that as a real highlight. And of course, the one with Robin Williams was so great to be able to work with him. And at one point, Richard Dreyfuss came to visit him on set. That was very exciting. And but we had so many terrific guest actors. There was one I really enjoyed working on that Barry Levinson directed called The Gas Man with Bruno Kirby and Richard Edson. Um, it was just fantastic, really a great experience. Though I remember we were shooting that episode, Susan. It was so cold, so freezing cold. It's, it's, it's fun to be out, not on the set, but we were often in terrible conditions, terrible weather. And I remember one time the AD, Jay Tobias, thought that there was going to be a terrible storm, and so we moved everything indoors. And on that day, it was a beautiful blue sky with fluffy clouds, and so Jim Finney said, "That's it. We're not ever going to cover for weather ever again." And we found ourselves filming
we
in just
didn't.
terrible conditions, like pouring rain, monsoon rain, and we'd be in the middle of it. But that's real life, isn't it? And it's free. So we'd be out in blizzards and rain and freezing weather.
Like, the snow was real. When you watch some shows, it's like fake snow, right? Or digital snow. It was never fake snow
No.
on Homicide. We were out there in it. And a couple things. Speaking of the Lily Tomlin episode, there were scenes where they were transporting her from one, I don't know if it was from one jail to whatever they were transporting for, and you couldn't be in the back seat. And they cut one of the Cavaliers in half. Do you remember that?
Oh yes, absolutely.
So that you could shoot her without being in the back seat.
Right. So the interesting thing when I started on Homicide, the camera was always in the back seat. That was it. I had a piece of plastic that I could slide on, made out of silicone, so I could fly from one side to the other, and I was in the back seat. And I found this a little annoying. So then I said, well, because I used to do it in documentaries, I can just sit on the windowsill and have the camera in my lap, and we can go down the street and I can get cross shots. And we actually did that. This would be absolutely illegal today. It would be not allowed.
I think it was illegal then, John.
So we'd actually go down the street. I'd be in the window, and then on the driver's side, I'd be in the window. The guy would be driving, and I'd be in the window. But then Jim said, "Well, we need to build something. This is ridiculous." So we had the grips build a platform on wheels, and or actually they built a box that attached to the door that I could sit in. So it was really a jerry-rigged operation. But then, yes, we wanted to be able to get Lily Tomlin straight on, so that the grips built. They built a trailer. They cut the car in half to got rid of the motor, and then built a box around that, so we could have the lights inside the box, and sound baffling. And they took the window out, so it could be right over um, the driver's wheel, and look at all three of them straight on, because we never used a green screen or anything like that. So we were going down major highways. I was watching that episode recently. I couldn't believe there were trucks roaring by, people passing. It didn't look safe at all. And there's Lily Tomlin in the back seat doing this most amazing dialogue and scene. Was terrific. And there was quite a bit of driving in that episode, as I recall, because they go all the way to Pennsylvania to pick her up to bring her back to Baltimore. And so there was quite a bit of driving. And this completely jerry-rigged. Jim didn't think much of that box that they made for me. He thought it was just terrible, but it was perfectly usable and worked great.
And I think on the Gas Man, was it on the Gas Man where the grips constructed on the tow trailer? They constructed the track that went all the way around. I don't think it was probably maybe 270 around the front and sides of the car for your butt dolly. And so you're on the butt dolly on a platform that's been built around the car, and it's being towed down the street as you are moving back and forth on the butt dolly with the camera on your shoulder.
Right. That's correct. That's why when you see that scene, there's a scene where they're driving through a park, so it's not actually a real road, and they're following Brower's wife, Amy Brower, actually. They're following her, and so yes, we had this whole crazy contraption, and I was able to move from one side and around to the other window. Actually, it was like a 180. Because the Grips invented a system of what we called a butt dolly. It was had skateboard wheels at a 90-degree angle, and they would bend pipe into circles or into turns, and we would attach them together. And so I'd be able to sit on this and then pull myself along with my legs being handheld. And so often we had scenes where we're going around the interrogation table. There'd be this circle of pipe and a butt dolly, and we'd go flying around. Or sometimes, I remember we did a scene in a school where there's a teacher, and we could, with the butt dolly, go down and then make a turn and go around, and then there was another turn. So you could make any configuration that you wanted.
That's brilliant. And can I throw a question to both of you? So Susan, you obviously work with Jean. What was it? How did you both sort of come to work with each other, and what was it like working together on Homicide?
I had been out of the business for a few years and got back in the business on the movie Gettysburg. Was the first thing I did when I moved back to Baltimore, and then so that was through my LA contacts. But then somehow, I don't know, I guess because people knew I was in town, I guess I made a couple phone calls to people I went to college with. I ended up on Serial Mom with Boots, who became the first assistant on Homicide. And so it was Boots, and Tom Lappin was the second AC, and then I was the loader on Serial Mom. And then they asked me if I wanted to come on to Homicide. So the first season, or at least I think it was the first season, Jean, I was with you, because I also was not on the first season. I was started on the second season. It was Boots, and Tom Lappin was the second, and I was the loader. And then Tom left, and I bumped up into the second assistant position, and we brought in, I guess earlier, I was Dave earlier, who we brought in as a loader at some point. First of all, I had been used to working with a handheld cameraman in LA, John Alonzo, who handheld 35 millimeter camera, Panaflexes with a 1,000 millimeter, with a 1,000 foot magazine and a zoom on the front. So, and I had developed, what are those called? Those cysts in your wrist, because it was my job as the second. So the first could have his hands free to grab the camera off his shoulder and hold it with my wrist bent back. So I was very, very happy to be on the show with a camera that was as portable and beautiful and easy to work with as the Aton. Also easy to load, easy for us to, much less, the equipment wasn't as heavy, although we had a lot of equipment for sure. But Jean was a delightful. It was a delightful show to work on. Jean was just always like he is today. He's always happy. He was always calm. You may remember if you got mad at some point, Jean, but I don't remember you ever being mad. Boots was also a very low key guy and was an amazing focus puller. It was a terrific, absolutely terrific group of people, and Jean was just amazing to watch his ballet skills and how he danced around, on the set. It was amazing. It was a tough show because we moved a lot. We had to move fast. We did have Jim Finnerty tapping on his watch all day long, like, get moving, get moving. But Jean, it was a real pleasure. I was on it almost 6 years. I left early on the last season I was there, but yeah, it was a pleasure.
Well, yeah, so I'd like to say it was a very joyful set. Sometimes on the point of ecstatic set. And I do remember there are times where things got a little difficult, and I would scream, okay, I would call out for scream therapy. Remember that, Susan? On 3, everyone scream as loud as you can. You have the whole crew and all the actors shrieking as loud as they could. And it's just to shake it off, because it can get tense. There were moments where there would be comeupples between the director and the actors, or the actors and the writers. But as a DP, when this happened, I would just sit down and have a nap. But it was pretty rare that there would be any trouble.
Yeah, that scream therapy sounds good.
It really works. Definitely works.
Do you still do that? Or?
No. No, everyone's too damn serious now. It's terrible. There's no fun, no levity.
One technical question before we sort of go into our last sort of area. Camera technology's changed a lot, and obviously you mentioned the Arri Mini, I think, earlier. And I just recently watched this film called The Creator, where they shot it on a Sony FX3, which is it's almost like a DSLR type camera, and that's now on a big cinema film. And it looked beautiful, by the way. And I was wondering now, with that new technology, and obviously cameras being more sensitive than they were shooting on 16mm, if somebody was to do Homicide, the next generation, whatever you want to call it, what would you use to kind of achieve a look that kind of was still in that style? Would you use anything different, or would you go back to film, or what would you do?
No, I would never go back to film. A film is awful stuff. It's ecologically a disaster. And I find that the video cameras today are absolutely astonishing. I hated video in the beginning because they looked terrible, but eventually now today it's just amazing what the cameras can do. So I see no reason. I would probably use the Mini or the Sony. Though if somebody said, no, we want much smaller, much more portable cameras, just there are ways of doing it. The difficulty is the focus, is how to attach a proper focus to these cameras and also be able to control the f-stop. Like on the Homicide, I'd be controlling my own. I would be controlling the f-stop. We'd be outside, and this time we're running into a house, and I would slowly open it, open up the f-stop from an 8 to all the way to a 2.2, and so So if you're doing this kind of show, I think you do want to have a control over those two things:
Mm.
focus and exposure.
And I think that's something most people don't understand about film, and obviously also digital filmmaking, because there's always going to be a lag in the camera refocusing. Is that there's a person focusing the lens who's not looking through the lens, which is a really highly specialized skill that I think a lot of people can't do, and the people that do it are amazing.
Mm.
And I think it's a hard concept for people to understand. What do you mean you're focusing and you're not looking
Mm.
through the camera? Well, all you're doing all day long is judging distances. All day long is the camera, and that even more challenging in a situation where the camera's never on sticks, it's never on a dolly. And Jean is always moving. To have a camera assistant that can keep up with that focus pulling is amazing. Amazing.
Right. That was especially important since I would often not tell the guy what I'm doing. So that you got to keep up with me and watch what's happening. And Boots was very, very good at that.
Yeah, I think we both well, the three of us think this as we've been rewatching episodes. Certainly, we loved it when it came out initially. But I know it struck me when I started rewatching them. It's not dated. I mean, maybe a hairstyle is dated, or a jacket with too big of shoulder pads is dated, but the show itself, the way it looks, the way it sounds, the social issues that were attacked in it, the acting, I mean, it is completely current 30 years after it was started, production started. Why do you think that is, Jean? I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the look of it, because you were way ahead of your time as far as broadcast filmmaking, and the way
Mm.
broadcast television looked at the time did not look like Homicide.
Well, I think Barry Levinson and Tom Fontana were ahead of their time. They're the ones who really wanted this kind of look, and we're just too lucky to be involved, I think. And I had the same impression. I was looking at this thing going, this is not dated. I look at so much stuff that's 10 years old and it already looks silly. And somehow this still works, even though a Munch at one point is doing a whole soliloquy about how there's going to be 200 channels, including
Oh,
a doggy
yes.
channel.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something 30 years ago that was coming up. And yet still, I just felt I was in the moment, in the time. I think it would be very watchable today, and just as exciting and just as thrilling as when it first came out.
Yeah, very much so. And I think there are plans afoot to try and get it digitally streaming. So I'm surprised it doesn't. I've got it on DVD. You can watch it on YouTube a little bit, but I've got it on mainly on DVD.
Right. There's been some kerfuffle about rights. I don't know who over what. Tom would be able to tell you. I don't know. There's also a tremendous amount of music, so I don't know if that is a problem or not, that they bought the music only for a specific set of time. But they had terrific music.
Absolutely terrific. I was really struck. I was watching, what's it called? Full Moon, when we shot at that sleazy motel out on Route 40. Somebody had been shot in the motel room, and we went from motel room to motel room, interviewing. They were interviewing people that had been there. But the music in that was so beautiful and atmospheric, and there was a lot of neon lighting and very colorful lighting in the motel rooms and the bars. I think they went into a bar nearby. Beautiful stuff, and really striking the music.
That was Larry Williams and Leslie Libman. They were the directors.
Right.
It's terrific people, and they were definitely out there. Oh, and also pushing. Like I remember some directors would push for less lighting, less. Lee Bonner was always trying to get me to get rid of the fill light completely. Um, so yeah, everyone was trying to push the envelope a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jean, before we wrap up, do you have any sort of final thoughts or memories that are important to you that you'd like to share that we haven't sort of touched upon today?
Well, you asked me how well as far as the actors and the acting. I think on a show like Homicide because all the players were so excellent. It was really it just boiled down to uh, you could take your time, slower, faster, more urgent. Um, okay, can you help me out? If we block it this way, can you help me out? So then I can do this with the camera. And they were all completely interested in doing that and ready to play along. And I've been on other sets where I try to get an actor to help me out so I can get this move to work out. They said, well, what is this about? Is it about the camera or is it about my performance? And there was never any of that on Homicide. Everybody was completely into how can we make this advance work together. It was because it was really, personally, I think it was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. Absolutely.
Great bit of work you guys both did there. It's a brilliant show.
Thank you.
Well, John, I suppose one other question, because you are still directing today. You've worked on an awful lot of shows, from Law and Order, I think Law and Order, SVU, FBI, and various other things. I mean, is there anything you want to say about what you're working on beyond Homicide?
Well, I would say Homicide was like a highlight of my career. Then the second equal highlight was working on Oz, and then working on Battlestar Galactica.
Oh yeah, great show.
Was also a tremendous show. The writers were so brilliant, and the actors were all deeply committed. They, as far as they were concerned, it was Shakespeare every day, and so that really is exciting to work with groups like that. Many other shows is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of waiting around, and it's a bit painful. But I know I'm very lucky to be working. I don't travel anymore, so I just work on the shows, the Dick Wolf shows that are here in New York, of which there are 5. So that's very lucky for me that I have work here in the city. I worked with Glenn Close on Damages, and that was also a very well written show. And the same writers I got to work with them was on a show called Brotherhood. Was it Brotherhood? No, Bloodline. Yeah, Brotherhood was also another very good film with Jason Isaacs. Anyway, it is interesting, the whole thing with dealing with actors. For instance, I got a chance to work with William Hurt. We only had 7-day shoot on Damages, but he wanted to rehearse a long time, and it created difficulties. And then on the other hand, I worked with Harvey Keitel on a show, and he refused to say the words unless we were rolling.
Oh wow!
So we would be blocking the scene, and he'd say, "Okay, well, when I say that, I'll come to here," and then I'd have to show the crew, but he still didn't want to say the words until we were filming. So we had an assistant read the words as he moved through the space.
Like it.
I love it.
So I was always wondering if I could just get those two together, what would happen?
That's really 2 ends of the spectrum, right?
2 completely different ends of the spectrum. I'm amazed, and I just love actors.
Yeah.
What they do is just sensational. And the excitement for me of going from documentaries to a show like Homicide was to film these scenes and then see it put together, cut together, and it actually works. It was just such an exciting experience.
Sorry, a question just popped into my head. We haven't really talked about the actors of Homicide, and we've lost a few, like Richard Belzer this year. We've had Ned Beatty, is it John Polito, Yaphet Kotto. I mean, what were these people like? I mean, such a great cast.
Well, I loved all of them. Some of them were unhappy, and I have no idea why. And they seem to have problems with the producers, and I have no idea where that came from, because the writing was great, the hours were fantastic, the whole thing was a great hoot, and but I found them all to be so interesting and well, thoughtful and well prepared. and being able to work with someone like Ned Beatty was just incredible. And my favorite, of course, was John Polito,
Yeah.
who didn't last very long on the show. But this is a terrific guy.
No, he was fantastic. Actually, weirdly, one of my favorite episodes, because I found it so moving, is the episode where they've killed him off because of suicide. And it's his funeral and stuff, and it's a very moving episode.
Yeah, that was a terrific episode by Whitney Rancic was the director, and he was a very young director, and he had a rough time of it. I think at one point Ned Beatty said, "I have grandchildren older than you," and Belzer said, "Hey, watch out for the training wheels." Yeah, they can be. It's being a director and having to deal with actors can be rough, but Whitney is a terrific director, and he did a tremendous job. It's one of the best episodes, definitely in the top 10. He had a bit of a rough time, but it turned out great.
No, it did.
Speaking of the cast, and Chris and I talked about this a little bit. At the time, and even still now, one of the most diverse casts, on a primetime network show. Certainly probably the most diverse cast then, 30 years ago, and still would be, up in the top for diversity, not of just, black and white actors, but also women playing unusual roles. But back to the black actors, there was so much movement and so many challenges with lighting. One of the things that strikes me, I could watch a show now where I feel like the cameraman doesn't know how to light black actors. But when I watch Homicide, I never think that. It just looks great, and there's never that sort of feeling like the black actors were forgotten or they didn't know they needed to put a little extra bounce here or there. But the fact that we were moving all the time and still everybody looked great. That really struck me when I first started, rewatching all the episodes.
It is amazing how well it looks, given that it was 16 millimeter. And I have it on a DVD. It still looks quite good. Yes, when it comes to dark complected people, you often need some large source to reflect on the skin, and that's why I believe we were walking around with Kino flows sometimes. So Joshua had not the China ball, but for Yaphet sometimes a whole big Kino flow to try to get stuff to reflect on him. Yaphet, I think, was absolutely one of my favorites. He was such an amazing actor. Yes, we miss him.
Yeah, it was sad to hear when he died. That was the third show I had worked with him on. I had worked with him on a feature film and then a TV movie before I came to Homicide. And when I walked on the set, he lit up. He's like, "Hey, good to see you." It was so sweet. For some, you think the actors, they see so many crude people. Why would they remember anybody? Maybe I stood out because I was a woman on the camera crew. I don't know, but he was terrific. And I remember when I was working on Star Chamber, which was the first film I worked with him on, at the time, standing off to the set after I hit the slate and thinking, what is that guy doing? Like, I didn't think he knew what he was doing. And when I saw the film, I was blown away. I was like, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what to do when the camera was on his face, super close up. He was just terrific in that role. And I think by the time he got to Homicide, even better. I agree with you. I really, really think he was terrific. And even more somehow terrific, it seemed, the performance came across even more on film than it did standing watching him in person. So he knew how to work the camera.
Well, also, I had forgotten all about Homicide, the book, and the description of Giudello's character is very much what Yaphet was playing.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite interesting.
Oh, interesting.
He really...
Because the real Giudello, wasn't he the SWAT commander in the show or something?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see him running around.
Yeah, that Gary D'Addario was our tech advisor, and then he ended up being the SWAT commander on screen.
Yeah, you give them lines and everything.
Mm.
The last thing we did was the Homicide, the movie, where they got everybody back together. That's every character. That was pretty good. It was very fun to have everyone reunited, even for a short time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good movie. I really, really enjoyed it. And I think, we were talking about the repetition, and there's a few bits and pieces where they do the classic repetition shot and the Homicide trademark, as I kind of call it. And no, it was great. It was very moving in places, actually. And yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, they did some rat-a-tat editing. But again, the use of music.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that was a bit unusual. I don't see that much on any show. Where the music takes over and it becomes a montage.
Yeah, it's very rare now, very rare. But Homicide did it so well, because some shows it turns into like Rocky 4 or something if you're not careful. You've got to be really careful with montages, like those Dutch tilts. They're very attractive,
Right.
but you've got to be careful with them.
Right. A little goes so far.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Well, I think we've done really well. I mean, is there anything else, Susan or Jean, do you want to add before we sort of wrap up?
No, I was thinking about early on when Jean talked about the weather. I was watching Sniper last night, and it was like you could tell we were shooting in full-on downpour. And I'm watching it, I'm like sort of shaking my head and remembering that the clear camera cover we had made for the cameras, so everybody could see, we could see what the footage was, Boots could see through it, through the plastic to the lens markings. But I also remember that camera cover being completely covered with ice when we were shooting in an ice storm one night off of Patterson Park. But also, Jean, you mentioned the never when Jay said, or Jim Finnerty said, we never have a cover set again. But on the Gas Man episode, I guess Boots had to take off for a week or a couple days, and I had to bump up to first assistant, which was kind of terrifying. But driving to work that morning down Harford Road, and I went past a bank that had, how banks have those temperature signs up, and it said -5 degrees. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to go pull focus, take my, my gloves off, to load the camera and pull focus when it's below zero. Beautiful sunny day, but ridiculously cold. And we were outside all day long that day. So yeah, and it truly was rain nor sleet nor hail nor anything. We were out in it, snow.
I remember on that same show you're talking about, the Gas Man, we were out at night on top of the lighthouse that's in the middle of the harbor, and with Bruno Kirby and Richard Edson, and it was so cold that Boots would focus and it would be out of focus. Say, it's not in focus. And he'd measure it. Oh, no, it's correct. It's not in focus. So what had happened, it was so cold that the metal had entrenched. And so he had to recalibrate the lenses to focus correctly. He'd say, no, this is where it's supposed to be. And I go, no, it's here. Look, here. And it would be off by two little micros. It makes a difference.
Yeah. And it started snowing when we were shooting that lighthouse scene. Yeah. It started snowing, and I almost didn't get home that day.
And those two actors barely had any clothes on.
Right.
Edson and Kirby, they were
short sleeve
dressed very lightly. It must have been -10 degrees.
Yeah, I do sometimes feel sorry for actors in those situations because they're going to pretend it's all great and normal and they're freezing their butts off.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh dear. One random question for you both. Are the crabs as good as they say they are in Baltimore?
I don't know, Jean, as not being a Baltimorean, did you were you a fan of steamed crabs?
Very much so, and also the deep fried chicken livers. that would
That's
sometimes come to set.
I'm gonna have to say that to Josh and Joe. Every time we would go to East Baltimore or West Baltimore. There'd be a little shop on the corner, like a little liquor store / convenience store that, like, unless you worked on Homicide, you would never go in it. Like, everywhere we went, everybody was nice to us, so it was like not scary to go in these places. And the grips and electricians would go get a bag of fried chicken livers and gizzards. It was gizzards and livers, right,
Gizzards.
John?
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
So they'd come out with this greasy
What
bag.
is a gizzard? Forgive my ignorance.
I don't know. I think it's like a appendix or something, right?
It's like the heart.
Is it part of the heart?
Yeah, you can have the heart, or you can have the guts of the
Yeah.
gizzards. Yeah.
Wow.
The tripe.
But it was those were
Tripe.
so good. You're so right, John.
They would come with a paper bag that would become very quickly completely stained with oil and grease.
oil.
And
Oh my God.
this was
And they'd pass them around.
That's what kept the show going.
It was a Baltimore delicacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were so,
This is the secret to Homicide.
exactly.
I've never seen that anyplace else. Never.
And it was shocking how good they were. Really good. And the crabs, I grew up here, and so yeah, I like steamed crabs. I don't have them probably as often as I should as a Baltimorean, but yeah, you can't beat Chesapeake Bay blue crab. They're beautifully sweet. They're hard. It's a bit of a chore to get into them, so it's sort of an event. You make it an event.
Well, plus Chesapeake Bay oysters.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Oysters are delicious. Yes.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, Baltimore tourism, you can sponsor us right here.
That's right. Yeah. Right. And IMDb, if for our listeners,
yes, if they're
please
listening,
check
yeah.
out John. Check out John's
Yeah.
background on imdb.com.
Well, Jean, where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your work?
You can look on IMDb. All the stuff that I worked on is listed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
John,
Thanks,
for your time
John.
today.
Well, thank you, Chris, for doing this and for being interested in this show.
So that was our interview with Jean. And just listening back to that, I really, really enjoyed it. I was just listening back to it this morning, and we managed to get quite a lot of depth there. And I don't know if there's anything that stood out for you in that interview, Susan.
There were many things, obviously, that I worked with him for 6 years, but have not worked with him since, and didn't work with him before Homicide. So it was really interesting to hear his whole sort of origin story. And I loved the part about in college getting a job at the local TV station, where he not only shot the footage, he drove the car, he processed the film, he edited the film, he got it on the projector, for that night's broadcast, I guess. But he described that as a terrific way to get experience.
Yeah.
And I think about how many of us start working for free or working in jobs where we're doing everything, and people may question that. But it's a great way to get experience because it's very difficult to get into the business.
Yeah, it is. It is. I could relate to some of what John was saying. Like my first ever kind of proper paid filming job was as a wedding videographer. And very quickly, how you shoot to an edit and you learn what you need and what you don't need. And it's a great way of learning about how to shoot a sequence very quickly with sort of documenting the real world. So, and under a lot of pressure too. So yeah, so I highly recommend that to people.
That's so interesting because that's how a lot of us started here too. I worked on wedding videos. I didn't shoot them. I worked as an assistant, and did get some feet in the door that way. But the first thing I worked on was a feature film here that I worked on for free. And I remember one of the producers, I had started as a PA and got my resume in and was hired as the second assistant. The first time I'd ever worked as a second assistant. And one of the producers, we were sitting around at one day, and he said, "Why are you working for free?" And I looked at him and I said, "I'm here. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have been there." And that was with Tim Surstead, who became a very, very well-known cameraman later on. It was great experience. I got great training there. So that whole idea of starting at the bottom and making sure you get all you can out of that experience, I really heard that in Jean's description of how he got started.
Well, is it in a weird way, because there's so much risk in the film industry and so much nervousness about that risk. Being on a set for free means you've probably got very little actual responsibility. So it's a great way just to sort of observe what's going on and get a taste of maybe the life ahead of you. Especially as a crew member, because you're working very long hours, and not always in particularly pleasant conditions, as you and Jean mentioned about the snow. I would hate to be filming in the snow. I've so far managed to dodge that. But that must not be fun, especially Baltimore.
Yeah, and I have to note that first film was a non-union production. After that, you don't work for free. Once you get in the union, no, that's not happening. But as just to get your foot in the door.
No, definitely. I was very interested in Jean's comments about obviously the influence of documentary filming style, and a particular cameraman called Don Lenzer, which is a good name for a photographer. And apparently Jean was very influenced by the way he shot things. And one other thing that stood out for me as well was just the technique from Laws of Gravity that crossed over into Homicide, especially in the early season 2 episodes that Jean was on, where they would sort of almost shoot continuous takes, or they would shoot everything in one direction and then do another take filming in the other direction, and then you can kind of cut it together in post. And that there were no marks for the actors as well, which must be quite interesting, because a lot of the filming I've done, you kind of with the rehearsals, it can get quite rigid. Somebody needs to be here at this point and that point and so on. So working with no marks is truly a fascinating approach. Not for the faint-hearted, I'll give you that.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting description when he talked about doing 2 contrasting masters. So you would end up basically with coverage because you're coming from 2 different directions. But also when he said, you have 2 actors, you really only need 2 angles. One coming from one side becomes the way he lit it. If you're shooting from one side and you have a light coming from this side, you backlight the second actor and it's the key light on the first actor, and you have another light on the other side that's the key light for the second actor and the backlight for the first actor. It was really interesting the way he talked about how he dealt with keeping things simple, but also gave these huge amounts of leeway and coverage for the editors. And about marks, it was really nice as a second assistant not to have to do marks on that show, because if anybody's familiar with it, the marks they're a T. You put a tape on the floor in the shape of a T where the actors put their feet. And you use different color tape for every actor so they know where to go. So if that show had been done with marks, and what you do is you carry, I would have on many other shows like Murder, She Wrote, Scarface, any of the other big shows I worked on, you'd have about 6 rolls of tape hanging off your tool belt, all different colors, black, white, red, green, yellow. And you put the marks down as they block the scene so the actors know where to go. Then the stand-ins come in and stand on those marks as they're being lit, and then the actors come back. But in order to be able to slap down marks really quickly while you're doing a blocking rehearsal, my whole leg would be full of different colored pieces of tape. I'd put them across my leg, and you have to have a tab. You would rip it off the roll in a way that would leave a tab on the end so you could pick them up really quick and slap them down. But that show with sometimes, 7 or 8 actors in the squad room in the same scene, thank God there were no marks, because it would have been impossible. I think it would have slowed things up. It would have been impossible for the actors just to look around and try to find out where they had to be. So that freedom, not only of the camera, but of the actors to move fluidly the way they wanted to, was really different from anything else I'd ever worked on.
Yeah. One question about that, actually. Were your rehearsals quite long before you shot a take?
It's interesting. He mentioned, we'd come in at 7 on the call, have everything ready. My recollection is they would block the scene and there was some lighting. We weren't ready to shoot that I recall right away. So there would be at least a couple of rehearsals. I think when he talked about how prepared the actors were, absolutely. And my recollection is maybe a couple of rehearsals using, one of those long sort of master shots around the set. And then the pickups, we would probably run through the pickup once or twice, but it really was fairly quick. We didn't do hour-long rehearsals. He was absolutely right about that.
Food for thought there as a kind of a, well, I say aspiring director. I am a director, but looking to direct more. So
yeah, and kudos to the actors who came in and, like he mentioned, could run through a 6-page scene, and he's going in here, going into G's office, coming out of the squad room, going to the coffee room. I mean, kudos to them. They just kept rolling, and obviously sometimes went off script, but kept in the spirit and whatever the subject of the scene was.
Yeah, brilliant. And another thing that stood out for me on a more humorous note was the fact that the crew were living off fried gizzards. What were those gizzards like?
They were, as I said in the interview, they were delicious. I grew up in Baltimore and have had a lot of weird food like souse and scrapple and pickled pig's feet.
Yeah,
obviously, as well as crabs and things like that. But the gizzards, they were just delicious, and they were actually, we weren't sure what they were. They're actually the chicken's stomach.
Oh wow.
Or the chicken's second stomach. They were small, bite-sized.
Yeah.
And, some kind of flour coating and fried. They were delicious. I preferred those. I'm not a liver person, so I would eat the gizzards, not the livers.
Yeah. Well, as a result of this interview, I'm now going to go and seek out a fried gizzard just to experience what this was like. So I'll do it for the podcast.
You have to make sure you come here. You have to make sure you come here and get the real thing.
Yeah, definitely. I'll share my experiences. So, Susan, for the benefit of, should we say, the filmmaking audience in this, what equipment was used on Homicide?
Well, I'm going to credit American Cinematographer. They came out and did a big story on us in, was it 95? 96. And luckily, they talked about specifically, technically, all the equipment that we were using. So it was an Aton XTR 16 millimeter camera, but it also was fitted with a Super 16 gate. So that made the negative a little bigger. So you had a better resolution for television. So that's one of the reasons also it looks so good. The camera also had, had double handles. So Jean could control it really easily. And one of the handles had a zoom control on it. Yeah. So that instead of the first assistant focusing and manipulating the zoom, either remotely or wired, that would be a wired zoom or a remote zoom, Jean actually had the freedom to zoom in and out and change the aspect of the shot while he was looking through the lens. We had a video transmitter, obviously, which is standard now, so that the director and, writers were in an area called Video Village where they could watch what we were doing as we were doing it. And a lot of the key people also had Watchman monitors. So the AD's on the set, he's got a little Watchman monitor and he can see it as well. We used a Cooke 10.5 to 52 zoom lens. And then we had a full set of Zeiss super speeds and a Canon 11.5 to 138 millimeter zoom, the long zoom. And the outside scenes, we used the 81 EF filter. And we did change film stocks, although I'm not sure anybody's interested in film stocks anymore, but we started out with Kodak 7293, which was a 400 ASA film. And outside, and 400 indoors and 200 ASA outdoors. And then switched to 7279. And then switched to 7279 for interiors and night exteriors. And I love this quote from Jean about the Aton, which was really true. After 60 shows, averaging about 75 exposed rolls per show, we have yet to get a scratch or a hair in the gate. I say this only because 16 millimeter gets such a bad rap. And 16 millimeter transferred directly to beta looked very close to 35 millimeter. And he gave kudos to Color Lab in DC, who always sent us a clean negative.
Yeah.
So it was a very versatile camera. It was a workhorse. And of course, Boots, the first assistant, would, every time we changed film magazines, you make sure the gate was clean and blow it out with, with compressed air. But we rarely had any technical issues like scratches or hairs in the gate or anything where we had to say, oh, we have to reshoot that.
Yeah.
Because the camera was so reliable.
Yeah. And just for the audience who don't know what a hair in a gate is, that's when the emulsion is sort of scratched off the film and kind of comes off as a little wiry hair, basically.
Yes, and it can be, or it can actually be a hair or dust or anything that happens to get in, which is why it's such a nightmare to shoot in dusty or sandy locations, because you don't want anything inside the camera where it's where the film's being exposed.
Yeah, and you sometimes see it on old movies. Occasionally, it's a bit of a shot. Usually, towards the end of a shot, there's a little bit of a weird wiggly thing moving around, a bit like an eye floater. And you're like, what is that? And it's the hair in the gate. And again, when I was at film school, I learned what that was. Like, oh my goodness,
It's a hair in the gate.
Yeah, and the Arton's a really cool camera because I think it has its roots back to the French New Wave, because it is a French camera. It was that and the Eclair were the two main camera brands for the French New Wave, and obviously Homicide was a little bit influenced by French New Wave, and I think it's because it's a very nicely designed camera for handheld use, isn't it, the Arton?
Yeah, especially if you're moving that quickly, unlike other cameras, and I came from 35 millimeter Panaflexes, which had quite the threading routine where you had to pull a loop out and thread it through the interior of the camera. The thing that was great about the Aton was it had a set loop, and you just slapped the magazine onto the camera. You didn't have to thread anything.
Yeah.
It just went onto the camera. The way the magazines were constructed and the way the camera was constructed. So that was a much quicker reload than it would have been if we'd been using cameras that you actually had to get in there, use your fingers and thread it through the sprocket holes and the sprocket gears and all that stuff.
Yeah, indeed. I used, when I was at uni, I used Arri SR2s and SR3s. And if I remember correctly, the loop, you had a loop of film that would have to come out the magazine. I think it had to be 2 fingers thick or something very imprecise, but that would be it. If you got that wrong, your film would be jumping around the gate of the camera, and it used to terrify me, absolutely terrify me, that responsibility.
Yeah, it could get really noisy that way. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's funny actually you mention that. On 1 or 2 scenes of the DVD, I can hear the camera because I'm used to the sound. It has a very particular rhythmic sound that you can hear if you listen for it. On some of the interiors on like the early seasons of Homicide, I think they got a better blimp as it went on, but
maybe, we had a very heavy blimp, which was basically a super padded leather, specially made cover that went around the magazine and sort of velcroed across the front of the camera. I also wanted to mention, just for people who haven't been on a film set, when Jean talked about Josh having a China ball on the end of the boom pole, wasn't China like glass. It was actually a round paper lantern. So it was probably, 10, 12 inches across paper lantern that obviously created a really soft light. And whether or not they may have, I know some of the handheld lights they used were dimmable, were on dimmer, so they could, but I'm not they might have been able to do it with the Chinese lantern. I don't think the Kinos, which were fluorescent, were dimmable. Maybe they were at that point. But yeah, so that was a paper lantern, not a glass ball.
And is it like a photographic bulb in the lantern, or was it a special film light? Can you remember?
My guess is it was, I want to say it was an incandescent, but maybe a photo incandescent at a higher voltage than your normal interior light. But that would be a question to go back and ask Josh, the gaffer.
Yeah. So yeah, I remember at uni we were quite enthusiastic about China balls because they were quite cheap to make, and with the right, photographic bulbs in them, you could get a reasonable bit of exposure off those China balls. Because on old film stock, which wasn't very sensitive, those kind of lights weren't very effective. But as film stocks got more sensitive, especially with digital cameras now, China balls are actually quite effective as a soft sort of source for people. And with it keeping a kind of natural look, because that's the other thing with lighting is making sure it kind of fits in with the environment that's that you're in and doesn't sort of stand out as a fake light, if you know what I mean. There's a real art to lighting.
Yes, and because the way we were shooting, obviously the set was lit for areas where the actors would land, but so much movement happening. You couldn't have 100 spots where the actors were going to land and have them perfectly lit. So to have the mobile, any kind of mobile lighting unit to go with the camera as it moved, without tripping over each other and making it look natural, really was kind of amazing how that came together.
Yeah. What kind of shoes are you guys wearing? Because the one thing I found when filming is every time somebody moves, the sound man glares at you because he or she could hear it. And
yeah, I'm sure everybody was wearing athletic shoes and soft-soled shoes. That's a good question. If Jean had anything special besides good athletic shoes. But yeah, squeaky shoes could be a problem. A lot of the interior set was carpeted. Not all of it. Some of it was in the squad rooms. So that helped. But yeah, that's a problem because it wasn't just Jean, as he mentioned, it was Jean and Boots, the focus puller, and the boom operator.
And the sound recordist.
And often Josh with the light following as well. So that's a lot of feet scrappling around.
Yeah.
While you're recording.
And I'm assuming the director had to go into Video Village for this.
Yes, unless it was Jean directing. Yes, so the director would be, unless it was a shot where we weren't moving around too much. And yes, it was an incredibly, and maybe when we get some sound people on, it was an incredibly difficult show for the sound department because there's no place to hide anything, right? If you're looking at everything at any moment and there isn't a set, you're not sure where everybody's going to be looking or where the camera's going to be looking at any moment. So kudos to the boom operators, of which we had quite a few. And often in that kind of motion, lavalier mics or transmitted lavalier mics that you would try to pin on people and hide them wouldn't work because there's too much rustling the clothing as everybody's moving around. Yeah. So it was a lot of recording done with the boom following the camera around. And it was very difficult for them, and they did a great job. And obviously the sound mixers were very, very challenged because they want to get perfect sound, right?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I look forward to having a future chat with some of the sound recorders and mixers because it's funny, of all the innovations in filmmaking, the one thing that there are very few innovations in, but that might change with AI, but one of the areas that is very old school is sound. You either get good sound or you get bad sound, and there's only so much you can do to fix bad sound before you have to resort to ADR, where you just replace the dialogue. And the dangers of ADR is it doesn't always perfectly match up, but saying that, that's got a lot better these days. There's a real art to ADR, and I think it's used a lot more than people realize. But that's for another conversation.
Yeah.
So
and additional challenges for the sound mixer. We were, besides the morgue and besides the squad room sets, everything we did was a practical location. So there is no, sound baffled rooms we were recording in, or sound baffled sound stages. I mean, even the squad rooms and the morgue were not sound stages. They were practical locations that were turned into sets. But then we're on the street, we're in row houses, we're on a very, very noisy street where the squad room sets were, where there were bars every other business across the street. Lots and lots of noise. They did a great job.
Yeah, brilliant. So is there anything else you'd like to add?
I thought it was interesting that Jean, because I didn't notice this. Of course, we're all busy doing our our own thing. But when he did bump up to directing, of course, he was still behind the camera. So for the camera crew, he was still behind the camera. But when he talked about he said to be a director, you're going to have some humiliating moments. I don't remember that. I don't remember the crew or the cast being sort of affronted by his directing, but he would know that because, he was the director. So, but, as a camera crew, he was still the cameraman. So, and he talked about how nervous he was the first day of shooting as a director. And you would think after being on the show for so long and knowing everyone and knowing how the show goes and knowing everything about it, he was still nervous, which I think it shows you the pressure, the different, as he mentioned, different kind of pressure as a director than as a camera, as a cinematographer. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And he is a great director. He's gone on to do so many brilliant things. And so, I love the episodes that he directed that we talked about. And his first episode, Sniper, is not exactly an easy episode to do as your first episode either. So he did very well.
And he mentioned it being a very joyful set, and I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I've worked on a lot of things. Of course, I haven't in a long time, but it's a very stressful atmosphere. Filmmaking is a very stressful atmosphere, and perhaps more so television, because you have much shorter shooting schedule and a lot more to do every day than you would on a feature film. But there were much less ego issues between the directors and the actors. I don't remember a lot of that where, on other things I've worked on, you'd sit around and wait while the director and the star were having a war over who was going to show up to the set on time and who was going to make who wait. There was none of that. And I think I've mentioned this before, but everyone I've contacted as we're sort of putting this together has said it was the best experience of their careers. And Jean said the same thing. And I think because it was so different, it had this sort of free-flowing, creative feel. It was groundbreaking. It imbued the set and the show, which is why I think the show still is so good, with an energy that was new and different from traditional television, broadcast television.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, on that note, I think we will wrap up. But Susan, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Please connect with us and share this episode on social media. Just type in Homicide Life on the Set to BlueSky, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter, and you'll find us. We're also available now on YouTube. Just type in Homicide Life on the Set, and it should come up there. And there are links in the show notes below. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.